Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Mythic Skyreach. My name is Tuskeh, and in this video we are going to go over the Skyreach on its Mythic difficulty, discussing what's changed, what hasn't, and offering suggestions for improvement during the public testing process. Before we begin, it's important to note that the content you are about to see is work in progress, and anything can change before this hits live servers. I'd be very surprised if nothing changed at all, because right now these Mythic dungeons are just a tiny bit disappointing, and I do believe an overhaul is on the way, but the numbers and a very small amount of things have changed. So I believe that a few pieces of feedback can be offered. Now, let's get started. So right off the bat, we have this first trash pack here, which introduces you into the whole mechanic of making sure you keep an eye on the initiates of the Rising Sun and their heals, which on Heroic, I remember when Warlord's Adrenal was first released, was actually quite an issue because these solar heals and their flash heals were actually really potent. On Mythic, we didn't seem to notice them at all, or at least I didn't notice them. I was healing, so I wasn't paying as much attention to the health of the enemies as would have been if I were DPSing, but it seems like actually interrupting those guys would be a good idea, and having to actually focus on that would make the fights much more interesting as opposed to just kind of DPSing through it. Although I will say that the group I was with was fairly well geared, and we were probably just a little bit over what the intended gear level was for these Mythic dungeons. Now, this second trash pack is one of the nastier ones in the instance, especially if you pull that extra patrol that's just coming around the corner now, and that does actually end up entering the fight. And there's a lot of stuff going on here, but again, none of it feels very dangerous right now. I mean, you've got these solar zones that are placed on the ground, and you've got a fair amount of group damage coming out, but it's nothing unhealable, and it felt fairly easy to deal with. What I'd like to see maybe is this solar detonation thing that seems to be a big deal, because you actually get a little raid warning about it that says, oh, you have been targeted by a solar detonation, move away from your allies. But for all of that, it only deals about 50k damage in about a 5-yard radius. I'd like to see it actually deal more like 150k damage around you. Maybe not to you, but just around you, and increase the range to like 10 yards. I think that would be cool. Other than that, the only real danger is when we have the enhancement shaman get a little bit low here because of all the stuff that's on the ground with the solar zones and things like that, and the chakrams flying around, alongside the flashbang from the little solar familiar. But yeah, I mean, overall, this trash pack, not very hard. We pulled several of them at the same time, and I had to dump a fair bit of my mana into it, but not too much. It wasn't too big a deal. So I think I'd like to see the difficulty of that increased a little bit. Maybe just make them hit a bit harder, have a bit more health, or make those mechanics a bit more noteworthy. Then we have this pack of Lowborn Arakoa and their Overlord. Now, this is probably a lot of tank damage. We had a very good Death Knight tank who was doing very well on self-healing, so this might be a lot of tank damage. I'm not entirely sure, but it seems like the tank takes a fair amount. I'm not entirely sure how many cooldowns she used, but she was never in any kind of danger, so I think that it would be cool to see that actually increase in damage a little bit. Now, onto the first boss, Ranjit. Now, this guy is just like Heals and Heroic, except the numbers have been increased a little bit. So he has the raid damage that he does, or the group damage that he does with his kind of chakram hurl. He puts the kind of circling wind walls on the ground, and he puts a small dot on everyone. So there's plenty to do, and if you get hit by the wind wall, you take a lot of damage. So it's good to see those mechanics doing a lot of damage, and he also does that charge, which isn't too noteworthy. It's just kind of an annoyance more than anything else. And of course, he has the 4 winds, where he puts the massive chakram in the center of the platform, and you have to keep moving in order to avoid the wind walls. Now, this has given me an idea for the Mythic version of this, and in terms of new mechanics, I'd like to see on this fight, making that huge wind wall, you see the 4 winds there, making that just a permanent addition to the fight. Like, he puts it down as soon as the fight begins, and you have to do the whole fight with that wind wall in place, with those 4 kind of wind walls moving around, and you have to constantly think about where you're placing the other wind walls, and you have to think about how to move. So I think it would be cool if he did that. And maybe he could also, like, overcharge it so it moves faster and deals more damage, or maybe reverses the direction that it goes in. I just think that would be a cool little twist on the current mechanics. It wouldn't be too difficult to manage, but it would certainly spice up the fight a lot. So that's Ranjit. Overall, I didn't really feel like he was too difficult to heal, and I didn't really feel like there was much damage. It was fairly easy, to be honest. I'd like to see him do more, and for it to actually feel much more mythic. Now we have this next trash pack, which has a solo familiar and a few of other guys, and there is also a whirling dervish in there. And thankfully there isn't a guy there who puts down the storms. Now the storms in Mythic hit remarkably hard, and we do also have these sun trinkets, which I'm just able to kill by myself here, which I think is a bit of a shame, although I suppose it does make sense. It's just basically a totem stomp, so that's not too much of a big deal. And then we have more of these solo detonations. Now, because we didn't interrupt very well, we actually lose someone here, so it would probably be a good idea if we had actually interrupted there. So I'm glad that those mechanics are in place, and that we actually got punished for kind of just mass pulling and AoEing everything down as opposed to thinking about it. Because I'd like to see crowd control become a little bit more prevalent in these dungeons, because you can currently just AoE it all down. I'd like to see something along the lines of maybe, oh, there's one really dangerous enemy in this group, let's CC him, pull everything else, AoE them down, and then just single target the guy down at the end. I'd like to see more things like that. Just note, we did also pull the Skyreach Arcanologist, which is the guy before the second boss, Arachnath. Now, Arachnath is actually the first time in all these Mythic dungeons. I did do them all in one day, on the second day of PTR. Arachnath was the only time when we actually wiped because the healing just couldn't keep up with the damage. And we did make a few screw-ups here. And basically, Arachnath, the numbers here feel very, very high. And I'm glad for that. I think it's good that they are as high as they are, because there's a fair amount of damage that comes from these laser beams. At some point, we had 2 on 1 person, and the burst as well hits very, very, very hard. And I'm glad that it does, and it gets very intensive towards the end of the fight. So it's a very kind of DPS race-like. So if you have good DPS, this fight will be much easier. But we actually do end up wiping here, and then on the second attempt, we get it, because someone actually got locked out of the fight because our Death Knight was a little bit too eager, which you'll find is a running theme in this dungeon today. So for the second pull, things go much better, and while we have a look at what happens there, just intercepting the beams, there's 2 on Mythic, whereas I've been told there is 3 on Challenge Mode, which is a shame, although I do kind of understand it. I mean, it makes sense for the whole context of this being Mythic and not Challenge Mode. But in terms of new mechanics, I'd like to see the constructs that the beams actually come out of, because if you take a look, you'll see that the laser beams come from the ceiling. There's like a big orb up there, and they go through one of the constructs on the side of the room and then into the boss, and you can intercept them from there. So what would be cool is if the constructs that the beams come out of were actually targetable, and you couldn't get rid of the beam didn't disappear until you killed them. They might not need to have a lot of health, because obviously it's still very DPS racy, but it would add to the whole fight, the whole concept of, okay, we can take more laser beams, but if that means we can kill him faster, or, you know, we need to kill the constructs, otherwise the healing will get too intense, and he'll get a healing or a damage increase from it. So I think that would be really interesting. So that's Arachnath, mostly just a healing check, and it's very dangerous if you don't do it right, and you let him get healed up, and just, if you fall behind on the healing, it becomes very dangerous. Now, for this next trash pack, the Death Knight got a bit overeager and pulled like he's used to on Heroic, which is pulling both of the Kaleri groups and the group before Rukran, and they annihilated him completely and utterly. I mean, that wasn't even close. The whole group got just disintegrated by them, which I'm very happy about, I have to say. I know it sounds very strange for me to say I'm happy that we got completely destroyed by trash, but this is Mythic, and Mythic needs to have these kind of things where you have to think about what's going on, because Heroic, unfortunately, can just be outgeared, and I think it's very important that Mythic can't be, because it just takes away so much from the experience if you can just outgear it. So, after we recovered from this, we just handled 1 pack at a time, didn't have to do anything special with kiting or the like, and everything went much, much better there. Now, the Kaleri here, just, they fixate on random people, just like normal, and they do a lot of damage, so a lot of airy roots and kiting and stuns and fears and all that kind of stuff, just to keep them from doing too much melee damage, helps a lot. And they do hit very, very hard, but it's nothing that couldn't be healed through as long as we didn't pull more than 1 group at a time. So tanks will have to be careful there. Now, this next group is a little bit easy when we wipe to the 3 groups. It was obviously the Kaleri that killed us all and not this next group, because this wasn't too nasty. So this is the Dread Raven Hatchling group with the Raven Watcher, or sorry, the Raven Whisperer looking over them and kind of exciting them. I'd like to see him do that more often, and making the excite that he does actually much more dangerous, so that you'd have to either focus him first, CC him, stun him, or interrupt him, although I don't think it can be interrupted. So maybe not. But yeah, this group felt like it was on Heroic, and so we didn't really struggle in the slightest. I spent most of my time actually just using Chain Lightning as opposed to anything else. Up next, we have Rukran, the 3rd boss in the instance. Now, first of all, you'll probably notice there's no ash piles here, and that's very strange. I'm not sure if this is a bug or not, but that does seem to be the case, at least when we tested it. There were no ash piles on the ground, and he never animated one of them to summon the phoenixes. So if this is a bug, then it's a bug, but if it's not, then it makes the fight a lot easier, and I'm not entirely sure why they got rid of it. So what other mechanics does Rookran have? Well, his Pierce Armor doesn't seem to hit the tank very hard, although as I said, we have a pretty decent tank, and he did let the Pierce Armor stacks go through, and it didn't really seem to screw him over too much. So I'd like to see the Pierce Armor maybe become much more dangerous, like increases the damage that the tank takes from it by like 50% as opposed to only 10. So it becomes much less about stacking and more like, you screwed up, now here comes the pain. Now the quills hit fairly hard. The tank was able to solo soak it and just kind of stay out, although she was a Death Knight, so she had an anti-magic shield and a few other cooldowns to keep her alive. The rest of the group took a lot of damage from it while we were running back, so I'd like to see it maybe hit tanks a little bit harder because they just kind of stayed out there and handled it herself. But in terms of new mechanics, I'd like to see him have some kind of solar sun breath of some kind that he kind of targets on the tank, and what it could do is it could have a really long kind of range and cone, so it could actually end up leaving a leaving a massive patch of fire on the ground, so the tank has to aim the boss in a certain way so as not to like screw over the pillar in the middle, so the group doesn't have to run through fire to avoid, say, the quills or something like that. And he does only seem to do the quills once, which is a bit of a shame. I'd like to see him do it a bit more often to kind of make positioning a bit more thoughtful. But really, that fight was remarkably easy without any of the phoenixes spawning. What you could do there is actually make the phoenixes spawn in numbers of 2 or even 3. That's assuming they are actually, you know, this is actually a bug and that they haven't just taken them out, which I would be very surprised by. Next up, we have this gauntlet that goes around this platform here. This is just like it is on heroic mode, except the Kaleri hit a little bit harder. Although, really, I never really felt it too badly. But, you know, I'm a shaman with Ghost Wolf and 2 charges of Unleashed Life for the extra movement speed, so I didn't really get hit that often. Some other people took a fair amount of damage, but really, this is just more of a gimmick than anything else, and it's perfectly fine. Now, this next group gets nasty because we start introducing these Whirling Dervishes and their Storm ability. Now, there are a couple of others in the beginning of the instance, but they don't seem to do this Storm ability. Now, this Storm hit me for half of my health instantly, and that is really, really nasty. You have to watch them so carefully, and I'm glad for that. I'm really glad that that Storm deals so much damage. The second Storm comes in here, and it's not so much of a big deal, but later on, with this next trash pack, you'll see that someone, I believe, dies very quickly because they stood in a storm, so you really have to watch out for those Whirling Dervishes. But other than that, there isn't too much in terms of danger here. You've got the Solar Familiar that disorients everyone when it dies if you're facing it, and that empowers, and you've got a shielding construct that just makes your life a bit more difficult. So this storm comes in and I move out of it in time, otherwise I'll probably die. And they also have these sun trinkets, which I'd like to see them do a little bit more in terms of healing, because this sun trinket gets off, it does its solar healing nova, and didn't really feel it. I'd like to see that heal mobs for much, much, much more of their health, because really it's a little bit underwhelming. So I think that making those totems much more dangerous would be kind of cool. But other than that, these trash packs are just fine. There's a fair amount of damage, and you've got the very dangerous Whirling Dervish in there with his storms. So you could either CC him or stun him or just focus him down to make life a bit easier for yourself. Next up, we have this Grand Defense construct. And this actually hit fairly hard. It does a lot of group damage, so stacking up together and using AoE heals and your survivability cooldowns is a pretty good idea. He's got the slam and the burn. The slam does AoE damage, and the burn does seem to target around a person and deal a pretty hefty amount of damage. You have to spot heal them to keep them alive. I'd like to see it do maybe a little bit more, because once I figured out who it was on, I could just throw a couple of hots on them and kind of focus my AoE healing on them, and they'd be alright. But maybe making it do a little bit more damage, although I suppose the slam, the burst ability, does have a fair amount of damage to it, so that's not too much of a problem. But yeah, I'd like to see using more cooldowns a necessary part of this. The damage is fairly high, so I wouldn't tweak it too much, but I just think that it could use a tiny little bit more healing on a particular person. That might just be me, though. Finally, we have High Sage Virix, the final boss of the Skyreach. Now, she is exactly like she is on the normal and heroic modes, and the damage is a little bit higher, but really this fight was a cakewalk. There wasn't really anything to worry about. First, there's that solar burst of hers that if you don't interrupt it deals damage to the tank. I'd like to see that be a potential one-shot, or at least deal loads of damage, because it really didn't feel that dangerous. Now, the first time this Solar Zealot comes down, it was in a very bad position, but again, we did have a Death Knight, so she just death-gripped the Solar Zealot back into the center of the room, and everything was fine. Then we have this laser beam that comes in. It's just like it is on heroic mode. The damage is negligible, and you can just kite it around the edge of the room. Finally, we have this shield construct. Just pick it up, tank it, and interrupt it, and that's fine, so that it doesn't do its shield on the High Sage. Now, in terms of new mechanics, I'd like to see her actually cast something that makes you think about your positioning a little bit more, because you already have plenty of ads, you have some stuff on the floor, so why not have her do like a 3 or 4 second cast that knocks everyone in the group back by like 50 yards. So if you're in between her and the edge of the platform, you just get shot off of the side. So you could either use these kind of little lips on either side of the platform, or you could get rid of those. That might make the fight more interesting. So you'd have to think about where you tank her. So where she's being tanked right now, kind of in the center of the room, would be best so that you could get behind her. But what you could also do is make it so that the laser beam comes in at almost the same time as this kind of knockback, so that you have to think about where you're positioning her, so you can't just put her in the normal position or right in the back of the room and then just stack behind her, because then you'd have fire everywhere. So it would make the fight, I think, a little bit more interesting, because right now, there's not really much going on. Not only does it need a new mechanic like that, I feel, but the damage just isn't high enough. I'd like to see the solar burst be much more of a threat to the tank, and I'd like to see the shield constructs put some kind of a dispellable buff on the high sage, as opposed to just being an interruptible channel. But really, this fight was a bit underwhelming. Hopefully, when changes happen to Mythic modes, and they better bloody well happen, hopefully they actually increase the damage here so that things become much more interesting. So that's Skyreach. I've always enjoyed the Skyreach. It's one of my favorite dungeons, but I feel like it does need a bit of work. The damage needs to be increased on some bosses, except for Arachnath, and there does need to be new mechanics added. So that will conclude this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I wish you the best of luck in the world of Warcraft.